He holds unique first-person accounts of many of the major events of the 20th century. He was the first network television journalist to report the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He covered Watergate and the Nixon impeachment hearings, and he interviewed Iraqi President Saddam Hussein twice, once in 1990 during the first Gulf War, and again in 2003, shortly before the U.S. invasion. But he is probably best known as Walter Cronkite's successor as the face of the CBS Evening News, a broadcast which he anchored for 24 years. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with Emmy and Peabody award-winning journalist Dan Rather. Do you find today, with all the access we have to media and information, the internet, that we're getting more information and better information than we ever got?
Well, certainly there's more information available now than ever, particularly with the advent of the internet. And if you know where to look and you can give the time to look, you may be able to find even better information because there's so many sources of information. The difficulty for most people is that they don't have the time to search through the tens of thousands, maybe even several 100,000 sources of information. I don't think the American people, overall in the main, are as well informed as they were even as recently as, say, 15, 20 years ago, particularly in two areas. One is on international affairs. At the very time we need better, more coverage of what used to be called foreign affairs, now called international affairs. We're getting less. So that's one area where I think it's impossible to make the argument that people are better informed. The other is investigative reporting, what I call vertical, deep digging, go down deep. Finding out things that are important for people to know, that somebody somewhere in power doesn't want them to know. That's one definition of news, but that's kind of thing that investigative reporting does. So in those two areas in particular, people are not as well informed as they were even fairly recently. And overall, in the main, I don't think people are as well informed. Having said to you that if you're willing to work at it, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of good places to go. But part of that has to do with the education system, that our education system, I think we can all agree, is in bad, perhaps desperate need of reform. So all of that fits in. No, I don't think citizens overall and in general are as well informed as they have been.
Which surprises me, and I think would surprise a lot of people with our 24-hour news source and full news channels, that you would think there's so much more there that's good news, but it's so much more of the same all the time.
Well, that's a good point. And I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. I'm an optimist by experience and by nature. And I think we're moving through a transition period right now. But when you say there's so much more news on, I'm not so sure that's true, because a lot of programs that pose as news programs now are actually infotainment. And even those, what I would consider to be better sources for news, real news, have gone through a period in which we have dumbed it down, we have sleazed it up, we've gone for entertainment values, and we've reached the point where entertainment values have almost, not quite, but almost completely overwhelmed news values. Listen, entertainment is very important to a culture, very important to society, but it has a different set of values. And it's always been a battle, particularly on television, to keep entertainment values from overwhelming news values. The late, great Edward R. Murrow was talking about this in the late 1950s, but no one was able to stem the tide. So we've reached the point now that, with very few exceptions, even in print, entertainment values have carried the day, and that's to the detriment of an informed citizenry.
Is it all just bottom line?
I wouldn't say all just bottom line, but a lot of it is bottom line, driven by first demographics and then ratings. It used to be ratings were the most important thing, ratings or circulation in terms of print. But now demographics, as you know, are more important even than ratings. You can have not a very large audience, but if you have the, quote, the best demographics, right. Say men 18 to 23, your program can make it. You know, I think for the audience sometimes we run the risk of losing them and they say, well, you know, what are they talking about? What we're talking about, and let's get down to basics, is that a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely independent when necessary press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. Mm-hmm. In a country such as ours, we depend on an informed citizenry. So when you say what's happened to journalism, and I think American journalism is in crisis, I think it has been for some while, that's what we're talking about. It's not something that affects just journalists. Of course, it does affect us, but it's so important for the society as a whole. So when we say, and I do say, and I do not accept myself from this criticism, that American journalism, number one, has been basically overwhelmed by entertainment values. Number two, in many important ways, we've lost our guts, we've lost our spine. I've said before and say again, in many important ways, journalists, including this one, need a spine transplant. The kind of spine that asks tough questions of power, that digs to investigate important things having to do with power that people need to know. I see some signs that we're getting better. I think a low point was hit right after 9/11 in the run-up to particularly the war in Iraq. There are some reasons for it, that no journalist, including this one, wants to be called unpatriotic. Mm-hmm. And we went through a period where if you asked a tough question, or you followed up a tough question, or you questioned what was being put out as, quote, authoritative information, you ran big risk of being called unpatriotic or worse. But that's where we've been and where we are today. I think beginning with Katrina, that American journalism, not overall, but there were signs, began to wake up some and began to ask some of the right questions. So I do see some signs of improvement.
When you talk about 9/11 and being that you were involved in that time, did you feel outside pressure to cover certain things in a certain way? We often hear there were pressures out there to do this, or was it just a feeling that this is the right way to go?
Well, some of both. And we're talking about in the wake of 9/11. I'm not talking about the day of 9/11 right. and the days that follow. Talking about the days that followed, when the country was quite rightly very concerned about being attacked again, and also very determined to try to get those who had perpetrated this horrible crime on us. But in the wake of 9/11, some in political power, not all, but some in political power, and unfortunately many of the most powerful, saw it as an opportunity to sway public opinion in the direction they thought the country should go. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. What was wrong with it, a lot of misinformation and a lot of wrong information, whether it was intended to be so or not, got perpetrated on the public. The job of a good journalist is to say, okay, that's what they say. Not only ask some tough questions, and also maybe get out and find out some information. Your question was there direct pressure to do so? I think the answer to that is yes, there was some, but a lot of it was what I described before. It was just a sense, and an atmosphere had been created that if you questioned anything that the powerful said, particularly in the federal government, then you could expect to face the furnace. There was going to be a lot of heat. So in some particular cases, heat was applied, and it didn't take much because other journalists would say, whew, you know, that guy asked a tough question. You know what? He lost all of his access to the person in power. Right. Or he began to get telephone calls and emails, not all of them, but many of them orchestrated by people with a highly partisan and or ideological point of view. So all of that came in, but I want to make it very clear, Ernie, I don't think there are any excuses, and I'm not the vice president in charge of excuses. And I've said I do not accept myself in this criticism. That whether you want to see it as direct pressure, and there was some of that, or you say, well, it was mostly just journalists themselves got afraid, I would say, yes, all of that, but it was not a good period for American journalism.
Yeah. When you look at that period, as that young boy who this is what you wanted, your dream to be reporting it, how does it make you feel?
Well, it depends on what day you talk to me, Ernie. On this day, it is, I'm 78 years old. I'm not perfect. I've certainly made my mistakes. I have my wounds. I'd like to think most of them were administered from the front, just to say I wasn't running from anybody. I've dedicated my professional life to being the best journalist I can be. And while acknowledging that I've never been as good as I want to be, I'm still out there trying. I would like to be a great journalist doing great work. I've never achieved that, but I'm still trying. And so you say, well, how does it make you feel? I wish you could play it over, but we all know you can't play it over. I can only say, I've given it everything I've got. I recognize that far from perfect, but when I look back over the roads I've traveled in journalism, I can say I gave it everything I had. I'm still giving it everything I've got, and I've done the best I can do. I certainly can see a lot of places where I could have done it better. And in the wake of 9/11, in the run-up to the war, early stages of both wars, I do say to myself, well, I wish I'd been a little sharper, a little better, and a little braver, but I wasn't.
But what's the drive that keeps you going? I mean, in any argument you would have on this, you made it to the pinnacle of this career. You got as high as anyone could get, yet it seems like you still desire something more in it.
Well, you see, I never saw it that I got it as high as I can get. I understand why you say that by a lot of measurements, if you become the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, you become the face of CBS News, and you're given the prime assignments, either given them or fight for them and got them. I understand the context, and I appreciate that, and I can be dumb as a fence post about a lot of things, Ernie, but I'm at least smart enough to know how really lucky and blessed I have been to get to be able to do what I always dreamed as a child I wanted to do. I do understand that, and I'm very appreciative of the positions that were given to me, or if somebody wants to say I earned them, the positions I was in. And I'm not putting that down in a way, but my standard has always been to do great journalism, be a great journalist. Adequate is inadequate. I want to be, and I've always wanted to be. I wanted to do great journalism.
Where does that desire come from, do you think?
Well, I've never known why, but I do know that from earliest memory age, all I ever wanted to be was a reporter. Now, in my time and place, the time was the 1930s, the place was here in Texas. That meant being a newspaper reporter. When we used to play those games as kids, you want to be an airplane pilot, you want to be an Indian chief or something. I always said I wanted to be a reporter. I think it's because my mother and father were voracious newspaper readers. And I think my own analysis is that because they thought newspapers were important, I thought they were important. But for whatever reason, I've always wanted to be a reporter. And you say, where does it come from, this wanting to do great journalism? But as I learned more about reporting, and as I began to study journalism, I realized that if one does it, and does it even reasonably well, that it's something bigger than yourself, that you can contribute. So I take a backseat to no one in loving this country. And part of it was I wanted to do something for my country. Remember, I was in puberty just beyond when World War II broke out. And I'm, in that sense, a child of World War II. And when I would hear Edward R. Murrow, Eric Sevareid, go down the list of great ones during the war, reporting, horrible things, but very important things from faraway places with strange-sounding names, I said, boy, would I give anything to do that? So you see where it comes from. It's the drive, one, to contribute, to be part of something bigger than myself, and two, when you dream as a child, those are big dreams. And since my dream was to be a reporter, it was never good enough for me, and isn't now, just to be an okay reporter. I wanted to do great journalism, and I still do.
What did you sacrifice to get there, do you think?
I can't think of anything that I sacrificed. Again, I've been so lucky and so blessed to do this, that I have a family that I love deeply. I have my wife, Jean, of 52 years, and my two children. When I look back on it, they made sacrifices. frequently with my not even intending them to do so. But I spent the better part of a year in Vietnam away from them when my children were young. When I first began covering the civil rights movement, I think the first year I worked at CBS News, I was home 31 days out of the year. That's 31 days out of the year. If I'd been older, if I'd been wiser, I might have hit the off switch and taken more. You talk about sacrifices. I don't feel that I've sacrificed anything. I feel that I have been given much more than I deserve, so I don't think of it. I think my family has sacrificed some. I think if you spoke to them, they would say it's been a great ride for us and all of that. But sacrifice, no, I haven't sacrificed. I have worked with people in journalism who've sacrificed, including people who've given their lives to journalism. I have worked side by side and slept outdoors and worked without sleep with a lot of truly brave journalists, some of whom were wounded, some of whom, as I say, are no longer with us. They made sacrifices. I can't think of a single sacrifice that I made.
A few guilty pleasure questions I have for you. I'm fascinated by what it must have been like to sit down with Saddam Hussein. The idea of being in that room with him, the fear for your own safety, the understanding of the monumentalness, poor choice of words, of an interview like that at the time you did the second interview. I'm curious from your point of view what it was like.
Well, you're very kind to ask. I did 2 interviews with Saddam Hussein. The first interview, which was shortly after Gulf War I started, I was by myself. I mean, totally by myself with him in the presidential palace. And that was a different arrangement than the second. Second wasn't much better, but I did have Jim Murphy, who's now at ABC, and a very brave executive producer with me the second. The first interview, which we've been trying for a long time to get it, I had no idea that we were going to get it. Was awakened in the middle of the night. I had a sore throat and symptoms of the flu, and 2 guys with automatic weapons come to the door and say, "You will come with us," and didn't know where I was going, but I thought I was going to the foreign ministry, quite frankly. And, you know, he's taken in the back of a car that's all covered up. But when we got to the presidential palace and the car door opened and I saw how many steps there were, I said, wow, you know, we were really at the presidential palace. But I still didn't think we were going to get an interview with Saddam Hussein. I thought, well, we're making headway. Somebody here is going to talk to us. But anyway, I got inside. I was unshaven and not ready to do anything. And the principal translator for Saddam Hussein came out, talked to me a little bit, and he said, well, you'll go in and do the interview with our president. And I said, well, that's terrific. I'd like to get my crew and my producer. He said, no, nobody, just you. I said, well, you know, I can't do that. You're talking about shooting it only with your cameras? He said, that's right. I said, well, I can't do that. Just let me get my, he said, no. Basically, he said, it's our way or the highway. And so I sucked it up and said to him, well, I do want to do this interview, but I don't want a cut interview. I don't want an interview that you have edited in any way. So I will have to hear from your president himself that we will have the whole unedited tape. No argument, we'll get the whole thing. So we walked deeper inside the palace, went down, deep down. They had an underground bunker where Saddam Hussein was. And I met him briefly, and through the translator said to him, I want to do this interview, but we've got to have the videotape, and I need your word for it. And he said without hesitation through the translator, okay. So that was the first time. And I will say, and I mean this, I'm looking for gentle language, but the pucker factor was pretty strong during that. I'm there by myself. Mm-hmm. It's a big interview. But all those questions run through your mind. I can truthfully say it wasn't a matter of being fearful for my own safety. That may strike people as strange, but it wasn't that. It was just, under these circumstances, what kind of job can I do with this interview? It was more that kind of fear. By the way, just afterward, mind you, we finished the interview. It's a world exclusive. You know how reporters' head run. Now I've got to get it out of here. And he wanted to give me a tour of the palace. And he insisted on, let me show you this great palace. And the whole time we walked along, the translator and his right-hand man was trying to get me to hold hands with Saddam Hussein. As you know, in the Middle East, it is not uncommon. It's very common for men to hold hands. And this guy was behind us, and he kept putting my hand up with Saddam Hussein. And I was thinking, man, one picture of me holding hands with Saddam Hussein, and I'll be selling shoes or something. I won't be doing this. And eventually, it became kind of a wrestling match. He was trying to force my hand up, but I was fortunately able to hold it off. That was the first time.
How different was Saddam Hussein the second time?
He was more pensive the second time. I talked to him on camera for, I forgot what it was, at least an hour and 20 or 30 minutes. And then he invited me to come, in fact, insisted that I come into his private quarters. And he wanted to ask questions of me, how it was different. He knew what was coming. He held out some hope that somehow, some way, protests, demonstrations in this country would give the president and the military pause and not come. And he asked me that off camera when we went into his office. But even with the interview, I thought he was more pensive. I thought he was more focused on the answers. Some of the answers at the time I did not believe. For example, he said he did not have weapons of mass destruction. He also said, when I said, you know what's facing you, there's the greatest armada in the history of the human race is coming at you. And he basically said, this is a paraphrase, yes, and we'll have to absorb a terrible first blow and a terrible second blow, but eventually, and he said, you will see, rather, that after the initial blows, things will begin to turn. The first time, I think he genuinely believed that his forces, while not a match for the U.S.-led forces, that they could give a good account of himself. But after Gulf War I, he knew that was not the case.
When you, and I'm assuming you saw the footage that was on the internet of him being executed,
Right.
How do you react to something like that? Now, here's someone you have dealt with.
Right.
I'm wondering just the reaction you had seeing that and how it was handled.
It's a good question, and I don't know that I have a very good answer to it, that it had been expected for a long time. It was going to happen. I was surprised, not totally surprised, somewhat surprised that a taping of it had been allowed and that the tape had been allowed out for worldwide consumption. But make no mistake about this, and I think if you had been in either one of the interviews, or certainly both, or if anyone in the audience had been, when you looked at Saddam Hussein and when you listened to him, if you knew anything at all about his background, he was a stone-cold killer and had been for a long time. I think you would also have concluded, as I did, that when his feet hit the floor every morning when he was living, he dreamed of one thing. He dreamed of being the modern Saladin, great Arab leader who would lead a victorious Arab army through the streets of Jerusalem. That's what motivated him. And the third thing was, he was a survivor. Some psychologists or psychiatrists could make more out of this than I did, but in Saddam Hussein's mind, he'd survived so much. Remember, he was in prison in Egypt. He'd survived so many things, that if you survive, you win. He really thought he won Gulf War I because he survived. He was left standing. Odd turn of mind from at least most of us in the West. One other thing about him is he was fond of saying, and said to me on at least one, I think, 2 occasions on camera, you know, you and your people, meaning Americans in the West, but particularly Americans, you don't understand us. You don't understand those of us in Iraq. But what he didn't say is he didn't understand us. He'd only been out of Iraq to the West. I think he'd been to Paris twice in his life. But he didn't understand Americans. He said to me once in the first interview, you know, you Americans can't take the blood, meaning, you know what he meant by it. I wasn't there to argue with him, but I was thinking to myself that, you know, we fought a 4.5-year war in World War II. We fought a 15-year war in Vietnam with 58,000 dead, hundreds of thousands of wounded. And how can this man sit here and tell me that you Americans can't take the blood? So he didn't understand the Western mind, and he didn't understand the United States.
Last question before we run out of time. When you look at everything you've seen and you've witnessed through your career and your life, do you still have hope for the human race?
Absolutely. I have great hope. I genuinely believe tomorrow is going to be better than today. Next week's going to be better than this week, and the world for my children and grandchildren will be better than the one that I have known. That isn't to say every day in every way about everything. But having said to you, I'm an optimist. That I remain an optimist, and we can see the world is better educated today than it's been. It's better fed than it was for some periods, certainly in the 20th century. It's easy when we're in a recession and we're involved in 2 wars, and when Congress seems so divided by partisan politics to get discouraged. But being discouraged is not in the American character. It's not in our character as a people, nor as individuals. And we're dedicated to both the idea and the ideal that we can do better, we can make things better, and I believe that.
And with that, I have to say we're out of time. Thank you so much. A pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
Dan Rather.
Thank you.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of Interviews, please visit HoustonPBS.org.